Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, we're looking at the first in a trilogy of action RPGs, a Contra game, and a caveman. I'm your host, Jared, and today is September 30th, 1992. The start of a beloved series of games was 30 years ago. Released this week in 1992 was Soul Blazer for the Super Nintendo. Originally titled Soul Blader, Soul Blazer is a top-down action RPG which naturally garnered lots of comparisons to The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. However, Soul Blazer has stronger RPG elements. Go into dungeons to slash down monsters, level up, and collect items. As you defeat monsters, you free the souls of people, making more and more NPCs reappear in the city, making the sense of progression be not just your character, but also the world around you. Only a year after the Super Nintendo's release in North America, it was dubbed that 1992 was the year of the SNES RPG, and Soul Blazer was one of the best examples of that. But leading up to its release, Soul Blazer got almost no press coverage or previews. It didn't even get a television commercial. The most it ever got before its release was a single-page magazine advert pointing out that it's an action RPG from the same publisher as ActRaiser. The few published reviews for Soul Blazer were generally quite favorable. Nintendo Power graded it on an average of a 3.5 out of 5 rounded up, or roughly the equivalent of a 7 out of 10, calling it a Hero Quest type of game. Electronic Gaming Monthly was even more positive, with an average score of an 8.25 out of 10 from 4 reviewers, each one praising its graphics, sound, and combination of adventure and role-playing gameplay. Were they right about it today? Yes, definitely. Soul Blazer is a fantastic game on the SNES and holds up on its own. Despite it being a clearly early Super Nintendo game, it plays fantastically well, and the way it's structured out makes it surprisingly addicting. Clearing out monsters and seeing the next town provides consistent intrigue as you want to see the next area. Soul Blazer became the first entry in what has become known as the Quintet Trilogy. Developer Quintet made 3 games on the Super Nintendo, all with similar themes and gameplay, but are not direct sequels, with each one improving vastly over the previous. The sequel and second part of the Quintet Trilogy released 2 years later and was called Illusion of Gaia. This all led into the third and final entry, which was released in Japan and Europe, but was never released in North America and was called Terranigma. Soul Blazer has never been re-released or ported to any other console. Even though it would be a great addition to something like the Nintendo Switch SNES library, it currently only exists in cartridge form. Soul Blazer went on to be largely ignored. It's estimated to have sold roughly 70,000 copies in North America. Its successors would go on to sell hundreds of thousands of copies each, making Soul Blazer the forgotten oldest child of the Quintet Trilogy. Speaking of forgotten stepchildren, also released this week was Contra Force for the NES in 1992. Contra is one of the most definitive games of the original Nintendo. It's the quintessential 2-player co-op game and basically made the Konami code common household knowledge. Its sequel, Super C, is just as good. Contra 3 on the SNES, released at the beginning of 1992, and kicks all kinds of ass. Contra Force does not. Contra Force continues the familiar run-and-gun gameplay, only with a very different graphical style, and plays much slower comparatively. And by that I mean it plays even slower, and there's even worse slowdown when there's too much on the screen. The biggest standout feature is that there is no Bill or Lance of the previous Contra games, but instead 4 all-new characters that you can swap between like it's the original Ninja Turtles on NES. They each have their own weapons, making them have their uses, and you can set another member to be a second player or a computer-controlled assistant. There's even a few top-down action sections and platforming that you have to do. It has some good ideas, but plays very poorly compared to what we all know. You don't even pick up familiar power-ups like the Spreader or Flame Shot. It's not good, and I can't recommend it. Turns out, neither can Konami. It's largely considered to be non-canon to whatever you want to call the Contra story these days, and at no point does Contra Force reappear in any kind of compilation, collection, or anniversary mention of any new Contra release. And there's a reason for that, and it's because it's not actually a Contra game. The original game was called Count and was set for release in Japan in 1991, but was canceled. Konami decided, might as well make some money off of it, and rebranded it as Contra Force for the dumb Americans. It was set to be the third Contra game, which is why in previews for the SNES Contra game, it was tentatively titled Super Contra 4. Then they realized the game sucks and took away its sequel number. Reviewers at the time were a bit divided. Nintendo Power praised the game, but of course they did. GamePro, on the other hand, declared that it was simply too slow, stating, quote, "If you're thinking this cart delivers the same fast-paced Contra cool action as the previous games in the series, think again." Contra Force has never seen any kind of re-release onto any other platform. Although, in 2009's Contra Rebirth, the WiiWare game, they did remix the Contra Force character select music. In non-Nintendo games released this week, the Sega Game Gear got a port of Chuck Rock. Chuck Rock is a platformer where you play as a thick-headed caveman and chuck rocks. You can also belly bump enemies and eat all varieties of meat throughout the levels. The Game Gear version is notably downgraded from the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions. Namely, there's no background, just a black empty void throughout the whole game. They also had to remove any and all music. Despite this, electronic gaming magazine sister magazine Megaplay loved it. They reviewed it with a universal score of 8, noting how smooth it translated to the battery-consuming handheld. Surprisingly, Chuck Rock is something of a franchise. There's the original, and then there was a sequel with Chuck Rock 2, Son of Chuck, for Amiga computers, Sega Genesis, Sega CD, Sega Game Gear, and Sega Master System. And then one more sequel of sorts with BC Racers, a prehistoric kart racer on the Sega CD, starring Chuck Rock and Junior. All three games were developed by Core, and Chuck was a sort of mascot for the company for many years. That is until they created an all-new character whose franchise ended up being slightly more popular. And her name is Lara Croft. For the other games that were released this week, here's Editor Dylan.
Also released this week was RBI Baseball 4 on the Genesis. You throw balls, catch balls, and run around a bit. But if you smack balls, then you need to run away so you don't get in trouble. Only occasionally stopping to say hi to a friend to build solid alibis for that hit and run attempt. The only thing this baseball game doesn't feature is portability. The Game Boy had Roger Clemens' MVP Baseball, a baseball game that features portability. That leaves us with a grand total of 5 games released on these 5 consoles this week in 1992. If my interpretation of baseball is off, or I missed some interesting facts about those games, please enlighten me in the comments section below. I told you I'd keep it short this week. Take it away, Jared.
Thank you, Dylan. Being a semi-obscure RPG on the SNES, Soul Blazer is quite valuable. It was released with a suggested retail price of $59.99, and now just the card alone goes for about $160. Complete it with a box and manual, and it's worth more than $300. That said, this week's biggest value gainer is actually Contra Force. As a late NES era release, it's now a rare game worth over $130, and with a box and manual, it pushes it near the $600 mark. It's the most valuable game in the Contra franchise. Chuck Rock has sunk to the bottom. The card is only $10, and getting it complete only makes it closer to $50. And that's it for today. Next week, we got an incredibly ambitious NES RPG, a platformer featuring an iconic cartoon character, and a bizarre first-person shooter. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. If you already are a subscriber, thank you so much. How did you get started with the Quintet Trilogy? I got into it because my parents got me Illusion of Gaia for Christmas one year. Then I went back and played Soul Blazer, and then thanks to emulation, I got to play Terranigma.